Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. In this entry, we'll be taking a look at Victor Creed as depicted in X-Men Origins Wolverine. While this film jumped the shark in many areas, I think we can all agree that one of the bright spots of the film is that of Liev Schreiber's portrayal of Victor Creed. As the foil to Logan, Victor is feral, ferocious, unhinged, and completely devoid of any restraint in his rampaging bloodlust. It's likely that several factors led to this eventual state, the first of which we need to consider is his upbringing. When we first encounter Victor, we find a boy who has had a rocky relationship with his father, to say the least. In terms of visual storytelling, this look on Victor's face as he watches James and his father share a tender moment says it all, implying that he has been lacking such affection with his own father, a man who has often availed himself to the influence of alcohol. And while it may be a foregone conclusion, it's a real fact that alcohol abuse often results in physical abuse of those around them, of which Victor must have been a victim, which accounts for his perpetually distressed countenance. When Victor's father meets his demise at the claws of young James, Victor displays no inkling of any sorrow or grief. If that is not the strongest indicator that he had no emotional attachment to his father, then I don't know what else is. But of course, living in a broken family doesn't necessarily lead one to become as cold-blooded as Victor. We also have to consider his mutation, something that Victor feels the need to conceal as implied by the fact that he trims his claws. Now, granted, Victor's mutation is rather discreet and fairly easy to conceal, but I'd wager that if he ever got injured in the sight of other people, the cat would be out of the bag, so to speak. Regardless, with Victor subsequently being on the run after the death of his father, he is treated like an outcast of society in every sense of the word. Victor never found a place in his family, and perhaps this extended to him not finding a role in society either. He can fit in from a physical perspective, but not socially, and he likely doesn't want to either. Being an outcast from society, the only form of occupation we see Victor engage in is that of a soldier, fighting in various conflicts over the ages. Of course, there may not have been much choice in the matter on Victor's end, as he appears to be of military age and would have been drafted in times of war against his will nonetheless. But it's still a win from his perspective, as unleashing an animalistic mutant like Victor into the trenches of war would be like releasing him into his playground. If Victor had violent tendencies beforehand, then involving him in war would be like pouring gasoline on the fire. Being exposed to such a destructive environment inadvertently desensitized him to the notion of death. And even before the opening credits are done, we find a highly volatile man who is completely devoid of a regard for human life. But there is one final cause that likely also accounts for Victor's savagery, namely his healing factor, an ability which grants him the attributes of invulnerability and immortality. Being free from the threat of death or permanent injury, this can only mean one thing for someone like Victor, an absence of the fear of punishment, which liberates him to indulge in his carnal animalistic impulses without restraint. Being ageless also has its side effects, the least of which are him being jaded over the generations of his existence at a world which rejects him. It also would lead him to belittle the mere mortals who are subject to the decay of time while he remains the same age. So with his history of family abuse, a rejection from a mutant-hating society which gave him no place in the civilized world, and with no punishment to deter him, not even from time itself, it's of little surprise that we see that Victor has developed into a remorseless killer, one who even revels in the fear of his victims, relishes their suffering, and takes pleasure in their demise. You would think that being a mutant himself, and with his us versus them mentality, Victor might be more compassionate towards his own mutant brothers and sisters. But we find this not to be the case, as Victor has no qualms about hunting down and even putting to death his fellow mutants under the orders of Colonel William Stryker. And why is that? Why would Victor willingly choose to subjugate himself to a human who would command him to harm his own kind? The answer to that is speculative, but it could very well have its roots in Victor's troubled relationship with his own father. Even in his feral and ferocious state, we see that Victor has not escaped the grasp of his basic emotional needs, namely, the need for parental approval. For all intents and purposes, Stryker appears to be a surrogate father figure for Victor, a notion most prominently seen when an agitated Victor is restrained by Stryker's reassurance that he is his favorite soldier. This choice of words is rather telling. Being a master manipulator, Stryker knows exactly the right buttons to push. It speaks volumes to their relationship, from the fact that Stryker would exploit his approval of Victor to quell his rage and control him. And to his credit, it was a tactic that worked. So we see in all this that despite Victor's hatred of humans, we see that his need for parental approval overrides any loyalty to his own mutant kind. Beyond having Stryker as a surrogate father, the other significant relationship that Victor has is with James, aka Logan. his supposed stepbrother who shares similar but not identical mutation as him. Victor's relationship with James is without a doubt the most critical of all for him. For Victor, James doesn't just represent family, he is Victor's only chance of not being alone in the world. No one else comes close in terms of sharing similar physical traits as him. And so when James decides not to give in to his feral side and actually tries to fit into society, Victor sees this as a betrayal and makes it his mission to drive home one single point: that deep down James is just as much of an animal as him, a truth for which Victor would even be willing to die at the hands of James in order to be proven right. In some sense, Victor's motive here is relatable. We all seek validation for the choices that we make in life. And when something as fundamental as our self-identity is being challenged, it can turn our world upside down. That is probably what Victor experienced when James rejects their way of life and chooses to live a regular existence, living peacefully and coming home to a loving partner after an honest day's work. Victor cannot reconcile this discrepancy with his own identity, and hence he seeks to influence James to rethink his approach to life. When James is overcome with sorrow over Kayla's betrayal, we see a hopeful Victor waiting patiently for his stepbrother to reach his breaking point and abandon all hope of integrating into society, in effect restoring the companion he has lost. So in essence, the mind of Victor Creed was one that was plagued by an abusive childhood and the societal rejection from his mutation, leading him to embrace an animalistic, savage persona with blood-stained hands. The height of his villainy, however, was realized only when he served the agenda of a mutant killer, betraying his own kind for the sake of approval, but not when it comes at the cost of his brother's life.